Thank you so much. So what I will do, and actually think the previous speakers, Andy and Liz, really provided important background information. And what I want to do today is present some empirical work that we've done on the just transition, taking this community perspective. And what I hope this will do is actually give you the background on the ground. So how do communities look at a just transition? And I think it fits really well with what Andy and Liz already mentioned before. And this research we did in Ireland. I'm based in University College Dublin. And what happened in Ireland nearly 3 years ago or 2 years ago is that the Midlands, that's the middle bit of the country or the island, used to be massively important for energy production based on peat. So Ireland was still for a substantial amount generating electricity based on peat. And what happened about 2 years ago is that industry was closed down. So peat production is actually closed down within the year, and that leaves the bogs empty and needed to be used for the future. So what the owner of the bogs planned to do is propose to put in wind energy or wind farms into those empty bogs. And what the EU had done is actually funded this period to move the peat production industry towards more renewable production area. And they provided just transition funds which were available. So if you then think about the communities and the workers, this had serious consequences for them. There was an estimate job loss of 4,000 jobs directly and indirectly. And if you imagine what it means to lose your job, you lose pride, you lose self-esteem. It causes a lot of anxiety because within the year, you would know that you wouldn't have a job left. And this affects communities, this affects households, wives. The socio-economic structure of the entire region is being impacted with the closure of this peat industry. Now, I've heard lots of different definitions of just transition. And I'll just give you mine because I think it's really important to understand what I talk about when I talk about just transition. So to me, the just transition means that the transition from a peat-based industry, in this case, towards a much more renewable region is done in a way where the impact to communities and society and the region and the workers and the people is limited to the absolute lowest levels that you can do. So to avoid that people actually, Liz called them losers, that the losers are going to lose too much. A just transition is aimed to actually make sure that the losers do not lose too much. So to reduce the negative impact. Now, back to theory, and this actually fits really nicely with what Liz was already mentioning. So if you look into the literature, there is different pillars, different principles that underlie this just transition. A just transition in a way is an ideal, but how do you now realize that in reality? And these principles are really related to what Liz said in a different order. So one principle is related to distributive justice. How do you distribute the cost and benefits of this transition? It's through retraining, reskilling, relocation, helping people to get a new job, new skills, etc. There's also procedural justice. Do you give people voice? Can they be part of the dialogue? Can they be involved and participate in the transition and the process? And there's restorative justice, which is to do with the rehabilitation of the area. Make sure that communities will thrive afterwards. So there's much more long-term perspective. How do you deal with them? So what did we do? We had interviews with workers, community members, union representatives. We also ran a door-to-door survey, and we went to meetings, public conferences. We checked their websites, their social media, to make sure we understood the debate that was going on. So let me share some perspectives from these communities, these workers, on how these various justice principles were perceived by them. So in the Just Transition program, we saw a lot of evidence of distributive justice, procedural justice, and restorative justice being there. But we saw in our data that the communities, the workers, didn't really feel it hit home. It didn't feel like a just transition to them. So a quote on distributive justice. There's a lot of training going on. There's people doing courses. It doesn't make sense. I was offered a course that I could have done, welding courses, but I've welded okay for 40 years. Why would I need to go and do any more? Because this money is coming in. I think you can spend it on training people. You can go for a couple of days course. It's not adequate training. It just looks good. And you can say, look, we're providing training. Onto procedural justice, to ensure that people can express their opinions, influence decisions. This quote was from a union representative. I think it's the level of frustration that people like myself feel as trade union representatives. It's a lack of engagement, real engagement, from people who represent the workforce, and particularly the lack of engagement with the company. ESB, the owner of the companies, announced the closure of stations in November. We're 3 months down the road now, and we've had no real engagement with the company around what we believe a just transition should look like. Let's move on to restorative justice. How did they feel about ensuring that rehabilitation of the workers and communities was actually taken care of? I said, no matter what we get, you will never replace this industry. That's my view. Okay, the other thing, I suppose, wind, the scope for wind, but it's not going to create employment. Solar, the scope for that as well, but it's not going to create long-term sustainable employment. I don't know, it's going to be very hard to replace employment in the Midlands. So there's a strong feeling, there's no future in the area to replace what these people had. Now, all these quotes and all the impression we got indicates there's actually a lot of frustration, anger, skepticism, lack of trust, because promise there's going to be a just transition, and it did not feel like it was a just transition. But that has really important implications for the future. Because if you then think about the future development of this region, the same company that's responsible for this just transition is proposing to build wind farms. But what people, and I think this picture is absolutely excellent to show that, what people say is, well, if we don't get a just transition, we will not accept your wind farms. It's not because of the wind farms, it's because they did not get their promised just transition. So I said we also did a survey to actually work out how communities felt about the future. And on the one hand, there was this proposal of a wind turbine, a wind farm in the region on the box, but the communities also developed their own plan. They wanted to restore these bogs into their original state. And if it had to be renewable energy, they would prefer to put solar panels in these bogs. So then we asked them to evaluate these two plans. And what we see is the acceptance of their own plan. So the wilderness park with solar panels was much more acceptable than a top-down decision about the introduction of wind energy. Now, why is this? They felt much more control over the decision if it came from the community. They felt much more ownership over this plan. So this is why they also thought it was much more acceptable. Last quote. So how just is this just transition? What's happened since the implementation of just transition? Zero. That's the answer. That is the answer. Absolutely nothing. Because it's all paper talk. It's all paper talk, and it's answering the right questions. If someone asks you a question, and if you give them the right answer, people will go in happy with themselves. But the right answer might never materialize. So lots of skepticism. Final slide. What might we do? What we see is a huge gap between theory and practice. We all agree we need to help these losers. In practice, they did not feel there was any help. So what we think is really missing here is a transition process. How do you translate this idea of a just transition into reality? And in this process, I think you need someone, an objective outsider, who helps to think about what does a just transition mean for the different stakeholders in the process. From a community perspective, involve workers and communities, reduce their vulnerability by already thinking about the regional development and rehabilitation. You can prevent these things. And finally, restore communities' control. They want to have a say in their own, in their future. What do they want to get? So thank you very much. This work has just been published. I'll send a link after the presentation.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Geertje. Round of applause from all of us here on the other side of those muted mics. Absolutely brilliant. I've been scribbling down lots of notes here, and one thing that came home was so Veronique, who spoke in our first panel session, and we said, what is a just transition? And she went, I don't know, it means nothing to me, just get on with it. And so really that looking for action and impacts rather than just a whole load of talk. Does that resonate with some of what you were saying?
Definitely, because you can see in one of the last quotes, these communities really refer to it as paper talk. They were so skeptical, and it's partly to do with the word just transition. They are promised something that's fair, that's just, and then they get something they don't recognize as being justice to them. So you see a real discrepancy in sort of what is presented as something that's just, but it doesn't feel like that because it wasn't tailored to their needs.
Mm-hmm. And so with this, Geertje, and I'm going to gently guide us into our next speakers who come from quite a specific industry space. So this is something where a lot of what we've been speaking about over the last hour or so is really difficult to perhaps measure. And so therefore, when we're trying to disclose, or we're trying to measure it or monitor it, or for an investor, for example, be able to say, yes, I'm investing in the right thing. How can we do that with regards to everything that you've just been speaking about?
So what I think, and I think this came across in the panel discussion earlier when we started, I think you also discussed it either yesterday or this morning, is this definition. What do we mean by a just transition? And one of the problems you see is that every stakeholder, every like community, any worker, any industry, government, they all have different ideas of what a just transition means. And if you don't talk about what do you understand as being a just transition, you can never translate it into a program, into practice that meets everyone's needs and manages these expectations. So I think one thing to do is actually have that discussion like you did before. What do you understand is a just transition, and what are the expectations?
And is that something actually where, because everybody has a different understanding of what it is, if you are stuck in the middle, so say, for example, we're going to introduce Mark and Alice shortly because they've just joined us, which is brilliant. So say, for example, you are a royalties company or you're someone who's there investing in an asset, or you own part of an asset that a mining company is operating. They're of course dealing or kind of working with different communities, etc. But then as the royalties company, you then have investors in you. How do you deal with these two perhaps discrepant opinions with regards to what a just transition is?
So I think you actually need an independent third party. I don't think as a company you can have the objectivity or be seen as objective. So I think you need to organize someone who is seen as objective by all stakeholders to run that process, and to talk to all stakeholders and be objective and try to bring everyone together. But if a company is taking that lead, fair enough, I understand where it's coming from. I'm not sure communities like the ones we talk to would see them as being objective. So I do think you need to find an organization or a party who can be that neutral person in the middle.
So actually trying to remove some of those barriers of perception, perhaps with regards to what's in it for different people. Fantastic. Excellent. So with that, Geertje, thank you so much for bringing that research to the table. And I'm sure lots of us will be looking for the paper if, of course, we can get access to it. So absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much, Geertje. Great.